Don't change your crank lengths without doing the following. Hey, it's Justin here from MyVeloFit. Today we're going to talk about what other adjustments you need to make to your fit when you change your crank length to make sure you're getting the best results.
Welcome to MyVeloFit, the world's first online AI-powered bike fit. Built by bike fitters for all riders.
Changing crank length has become increasingly popular, and for good reasons. There can be performance, comfort, aero, all kinds of benefits from primarily reducing your crank length, but sometimes lengthening. Changing crank length has been a pretty normal adjustment in bike fitting for years, if not decades, and a lot of the research goes back to kind of the 1970s and 80s. But more recently, and particularly because it's become more common in the pro peloton, shortening crank length has become increasingly popular, and a lot of riders, if you've ever tried to buy a set of shorter cranks recently, are jumping on this trend, and for good reason. Without getting too deep into why you might want to change your cranks, the primary reason riders do it is to open up their hip angle over the top of the pedal stroke. This can be because you're a smaller rider and most bike parts aren't just well suited to your body size. It could be because you have tight hips and they don't even need to be super tight, but maybe you just work at a desk all day and getting your hip over the top is challenging. You experience some impingement, so reducing the crank length can help with that. Maybe you're chasing a more aero position, so your torso angle is lower, and so you need more space over the top of the pedal stroke, and this is why shorter cranks have been popular amongst triathletes and time trial bikes for many years, much longer than on the road or gravel or even mountain bikes. So for any of these reasons, you may want to reduce your crank length, and what we're going to talk about today are the other changes to your fit you need to make to compensate for that. And they're also going to apply if you want to increase your crank length. So any changes in crank length are going to be compensated, and today we'll dive into how you can do that. If you've been following us for any period of time now, you'll know that we're big advocates of the appropriate crank length for every rider. And for most riders, this means shorter. But before any of you get triggered, we do advocate for the appropriate or proportional crank length for every rider to them. So shorter doesn't just mean 165 millimeters, it means the appropriate crank length for you. However, if you're changing your crank length, there are some changes you need to make to the rest of your fit to make sure you're getting those benefits. So we're going to explore what those look like. So the first change you're going to make to your fit is saddle height. And this is the one that most people are aware of, but some might not be. And essentially, your baseline is going to be adjusting your saddle height one-to-one with the change in crank length that you're making. So if you're reducing your crank length by 5 millimeters, let's say going from a 170 to a 165, that's going to mean raising your saddle height 5 millimeters. Why is this the case? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the main goal of reducing your crank length is to increase or open up your hip angle over the top of the pedal stroke. But what we want to do is maintain our effective saddle height, which is determined by how our body moves through the bottom of the pedal stroke. So if we've shortened the cranks by 5 millimeters, the bottom of the pedal stroke is going to come up 5 millimeters, and so we're going to move the saddle up by 5 millimeters to compensate. This should always be your starting place, but it's very common that a lot of riders don't necessarily need to make that full adjustment. Maybe they only increase their saddle height by 3 millimeters, but we'd always recommend starting with 5 millimeters, seeing how that feels, and then adjusting from there. Very rarely would you go more than the 5 millimeters. Often it's a little bit less, and this is a theme you might find throughout the video. The next adjustment you might want to consider is saddle fore aft. Anytime you change something in your cranks or your pedals, it's going to impact your saddle position because, your feet are fixed and they're always going to be moving around the bottom bracket in the same way. And your saddle position is going to be determined relative to the bottom bracket in your pedals. So anytime we change the pedals, we got to change the saddle position. So saddle height, maybe we've moved it up 3 millimeters or 5 millimeters alongside that 5 millimeter reduction in crank length. But what we've also done that many riders may not consider is that if you've shortened the cranks by 5 millimeters, your pedal at the front of the pedal stroke has also moved back closer. So you've almost effectively kind of like moved the bottom bracket back 5 millimeters. And this can mean you may need to also shift your saddle rearward to maintain the same kind of fore-aft relationship between the saddle and your pedals. Now, if you've moved the saddle up, this also has the effect of moving the saddle back because our seat tube angles are on an angle. So it could be that once you move that saddle up, you actually feel great and you don't need to move it back. But it's worth considering that moving your saddle back a few millimeters to compensate for that reduction in crank length can be something that a lot of riders need to do. And generally speaking, what they'll notice is they put the shorter cranks on and then all of a sudden they have a little more weight on their hands, and that doesn't really make sense. And if you want to watch, we've got a whole video on how to establish your saddle fore aft and how it impacts your weight balance on the bike, and those two things play together. So in short, if you reduce your crank length, your saddle may need to go back. If you increase it, it may need to come forward. So now that you've adapted your saddle position, which is the first step and maybe the last for many riders, we'll look towards the handlebars. And that's because our handlebar position is always set relative to our saddle position. So we're kind of working up, we've addressed the feet, saddle, now we're moving on to the bars. Assuming the scenario where you've reduced your crank length, we've moved the saddle up and back, and this is going to impact our relationship with the handlebars. So there's the baseline situation, which is that, okay, if you move your saddle up 5 millimeters, your handlebars should also come up 5 millimeters. But one of the kind of, benefits of reducing your crank length is the opening of the hip angle. What you may not have considered is, even though you've only increased your saddle height 5 millimeters, which let's say that's an opening of the hip of 5 millimeters, you've also reduced the crank length by 5 millimeters over the top of the pedal stroke. So you've had the effect of moving your foot relative to your saddle position 10 millimeters, which is a pretty significant opening of the hip, which means for many riders, they may not need to increase the height of the handlebars, which is one of the reasons that it can really help a lot of riders move into a more aero position. If you've adjusted your saddle height and your handlebars feel great, stop here, you're all done. You don't need to raise them. However, if you've increased your saddle height and you're starting to feel a little bit too bent over, the position feels too aggressive, you may just need to pop your handlebars up 5 millimeters or whatever the corresponding adjustment was of the saddle. And again, this is one that you might be able to go down. So maybe you raise your saddle 5 millimeters, you maybe only need to add a 2.5 millimeter spacer underneath your stem, and that could solve everything. So handlebar reach is going to be the final consideration in kind of your adaptation to this crank length change, and probably the one you're least likely to need to make an adjustment. And as mentioned, in the scenario you've shortened your crank, which is going to be what most people are leaning towards. If your saddle's gone up and back, you've effectively lengthened the reach of your bike between the saddle and the grips. So you may need to also reduce the reach of your bike. This being said, it's going to really depend on the size of the adjustment you've made at the saddle. Generally speaking, most riders won't notice a massive change in reach with something kind of like less than 5 millimeters. And realistically, stems typically come in 10 millimeter increments. So you're not going to be able to only decrease your reach by 5 millimeters. So sometimes just a small change in your hood positioning, and we've got videos on that here, can be enough to make up that difference between your previous saddle position and handlebar relationship and the new one. But if you've made a really big change in crank length, say you've gone from like 175s to 160s, that's 15 millimeters, that's gonna result in a pretty drastic change in your saddle position. This may be a situation where you need to shorten your stem, or you've had to raise it up quite a bit. So just something to keep in mind, that after you've adjusted your saddle height, if you're feeling like you're a little bit too stretched out, or conversely, if you went to longer cranks and your saddles move forward and you're feeling too short, you may, in some circumstances, need to adjust your stem length to compensate for reach. Great, so as with most things bike fit related, it's a little bit of a spider's web where if you tug on one side, it's gonna impact the rest, and changing crank length is no different. So if you're considering shortening your crank length, or maybe you've got a brand new set of short cranks and you can't quite figure out why it's not feeling right, just remember, you've gotta compensate at your saddle height, saddle fore aft, handlebar height, and maybe even reach. And specifically make sure you're addressing them in those order, and don't be afraid to do one at a time, go for a ride, see how it feels, let your body adapt a little bit, and then move on to the next step. One of the great things about crank length is that changes in crank length often don't require as big of adjustments as you might think to the rest of your fit, and it's all gravy. I can already read all the comments about how crank lengths are just a fad and they don't make any difference, and we're not gonna even get into that in this video, but if you're curious, we've got a whole video about myths around crank length here, and we also have an excellent interview if you really want to dive into the science with Professor Jim Martin, who's kind of the grandfather of crank length research. And you can go check that out here if you really want to dive into what the benefits are and why crank length may or may not be a benefit for you. We'll also link them down in the description. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. You can find us everywhere else at MyVeloFit. And until next time, thanks for watching.